What's up, guys? Today we're going to be looking at Japan. We just got through talking about imperialism and we've looked at other places throughout the world. We looked at Southeast Asia, we talked about Africa, we talked about India. Now we're going to focus on the country of Japan. And a lot of this is going to be in the time period of the 1800s. And we're going to see what was going on with Japan during this time. Again, the standard three, describe the reactions in Asian kingdoms to Western ideas of nationalism, including the Indian nationalist movement, the Meiji era in Japan, and the Manchu dynasty in China. Of course, we've already discussed the Indian nationalist movement when we talked about the INC and we talked about Gandhi in India and British control over India and so on. But now we're going to look at Japan. So, as always, let's look at our learning objectives. And again, you might want to pause the video so you can write these down. Explain how Japan emerges from isolationism. How does Japan modernize? Explain the growth of the Japanese military and its expansion into Korea. Explain the importance of the Russo-Japanese War on Japan. And explain how the Japanese ruled over Korea. So those are our learning objectives for this lesson. Again, if you need to pause the video to jot those things down, you can do that at this time. Okay, so let's keep going. And let's talk about how Japan emerges from isolationism. Of course, the term isolationism means, of course, you're isolated. You're keeping yourself distant from everybody else. And that's pretty much the policy that Japan was following. Japan followed the Western and European powers by expanding its foreign influence eventually. From the 1600s to the mid-1800s, Japan had stayed isolated. The only outside interaction was with China and Korea, who were very close neighbors to the island of Japan. In 1853, American steamships arrived with cannons and they entered Japanese waters. The guy that is leading this expedition to Japan was Commodore Matthew Perry. And no, it's not Matthew Perry from the sitcom Friends. This is Matthew Perry, the famous sea captain and explorer. The next year after Matthew Perry arrives, Japan is going to open up trade with the United States. So they're emerging out of this isolationism period. The following year, they're going to make similar trade deals with the other European nations. So the U.S. sort of gets this whole thing started. Of course, many of the Japanese people were upset with the shogun. And if you don't know what a shogun is the military dictator of Japan. They were upset because he made these trade deals and treaties. They still wanted to keep to themselves, and they didn't want these other countries coming into Japan and possibly destroying their culture. The emperor during this time is Emperor Mutsuhito. He got support of the Japanese opposed to foreign influence, and he is going to overthrow the shogun. The last shogun was Tokugawa Yoshinobu, and he was the last shogun, and he was the leader or the last shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. For the first time in centuries, the emperor would take control of Japan. It wasn't a shogun. Emperor Mutsuhito would rule for 45 years from 1867 to 1912. This period is often called or known as the Meiji era. The word Meiji means enlightened rule. One thing about Emperor Mutsuhito was that he was determined to modernize Japan during the Meiji era. The emperor sent government officials to Europe and the United States to help mold Japan into a modern nation, so to sort of help Japan begin to industrialize. They modeled their government after a strong central government of Germany. So they sort of took their plans or took the blueprint from Germany and made their government very similar to what Germany had under the Iron Chancellor in Bismarck. They patterned the army after Germany and the navy after Britain. So, of course, they knew that having a strong navy would help increase their world prestige or their world power. And, of course, Germany had a very, very massive army that they were building during the late 1800s. So Japan tries to copy both of these places. The Japanese adapted the American system of education for children. So they started copying us as far as education goes. The emperor also supported changes to Japan's economy. One of the things they did was they tried to improve their infrastructure by building railroads. They began mining coal, of course, for their factories. And from there on in, Japan's industry is going to take off. In just a few years, Japan's industrial economy equaled almost any nation in the entire world. So during this Meiji period, this is when all of this is happening during the Meiji era. By 1890s, Japan's military was the strongest military power in Asia. So Japan is really on the upswing during this period. Japan asked foreigners to give up their special rights in Japan. Of course, they again were trying to keep foreigners out at this point. So we know that Japan has modernized as far as their economy. Let's look at their military. They began to have that sense of nationalism, pride in their country, and this is going to lead to huge gains militarily by Japan. China would send troops into Korea, which means they broke an agreement not to do so, and Japan would intervene by going to war and driving the Chinese out of Korea. This happens in the late 1800s. The Japanese gained Taiwan and some other islands as new colonies. So you can see where this is going, and this is eventually going to lead up to World War II and Japan's entry into that war. In 1904, the Japanese are going to fight a war against Russia. This is known as the Russo-Japanese War. This war was mainly fought over China's Manchurian territory, which is in the northern portion of China. Japan surprised everyone by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Russia was supposedly stronger and better equipped, but of course the Japanese were very motivated, and they had industrialized and had built their military to where it was one of the strongest militaries in the world at this point. The next year, Japan is going to attack Korea, and by 1910, it had complete control over Korea. The Japanese were extremely harsh rulers to the Koreans. They shut down newspapers. They only let Japanese language and history be taught in the Korean schools. So let's look a little bit more at the Japanese in Korea. Again, the Japanese were harsh rulers. They shut down Korean newspapers. Schools were only allowed to teach the Japanese language and Japanese history. They took land away from the Koreans and they gave it to the Japanese settlers who were moving into Korea. They built factories, and all of those factories were only run by Japanese. Koreans were not allowed to start new businesses. And this sort of reminds us of what went on in some of these other places that we talked about, like India and Southeast Asia and Africa. And you can see the Japanese really are no different with what they're doing here in Korea. Koreans resented these actions and began nationalist movements to protest against Japanese rule. Okay, and that's going to do it for this lesson on Japan. Some of the key terms that you need to know here. Of course, you need to know who Matthew Perry was. You need to know what the Shogun was. You need to know about the Meiji Restoration and era, which we just discussed. Need to know who Emperor Mitsuhito was, the Russo-Japanese War, Japan-Korean War, and Tokugawa Yoshinobu. You need to know all of those people as we prepare for our next assessment. Now, these are your reflection questions. They will be posted on a Padlet wall, which I will put up. But these are the questions that I want you to answer on the Padlet wall. What was this lesson about? What was one thing you learned that you didn't already know about Japan, which is probably going to be a lot? What was one word that you were unfamiliar with? And I'm sure you can find a lot of words. And research one topic, event, or person and give some additional information that was not talked about in the presentation or the notes. Okay, so definitely do that on your Padlet wall. Make sure you turn in your notes. Make sure you turn in your Padlet wall, and I will catch you guys on the next one. You guys have a great day.